Hi, my name is Hannah Jane Pritchett, current U of A GIST Master's student. Welcome to the University of Arizona GIST podcast. Our host is Chris Lukenbiel, and today he will be chatting with Michael Dennis, a geodesist at NOAA's National Geodetic Survey. Let's get started.
My name is Chris Lukenbiel. I'm the director at the University of Arizona's GIST programs, and today on the podcast we have Michael Dennis, who works at the National Geodetic Survey and has recently relocated to the Tucson area. So we're excited to have you with us and to have you in town with us. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, Chris. Glad to be here.
So we wanted to ask you some questions today because you seem to have quite a lot of exciting geospatial things going on in your life that impact us locally as well as nationally and probably even globally. But before we started there, I thought many people would like to know, like, exactly what is a geodesist? Because it's very different than saying I'm a geographer or a geospatial analyst or a GIS analyst. So
yeah, we could talk all the podcast about this.
I thought that you and I especially could, but how would you explain, like, what is a geodesist and maybe how is it more specific to like even the applications of what you do in daily life versus, say, somebody that is just a standard GIS analyst or even a surveyor?
Yeah, so geodesy, being a geodesist, of course, is someone practices geodesy, one of those weird words. And honestly, I often don't even tell people what I do for a living because then they ask, what's a geodesist? Oh, you mean a geologist, they say, or something like that. I say, no, it's not that. The funny thing is it's probably one of the oldest sciences, really, even though no one seems to know what it is. It's really closely related to astronomy, another one of the really old ones. When I tell the GIS people oftentimes is that without geodesy, we couldn't have maps. We wouldn't have GIS. We wouldn't be able to even use the data that we normally use for mapping. So it's fundamental to what GIS professionals do, right? It helps line up all the data to make the maps, to do GIS analysis, and it's essential to navigation and surveying too. Anything to do with mapping. I could go into a lot of detail about it, but it's kind of a funny thing. So it seems like most GIS people I talk to have heard of geodesy, so I do run into that a lot, but they seem to be scared of it, which makes me kind of sad because I think it's wonderful. They seem to know it's important, and that's about as far as it goes, oftentimes.
But it's like, I guess the way that I would say it in class is it's to understand and to measure the shape and surface of the Earth, correct? Would you date it back to?
So the classic definition is a branch of applied mathematics dealing with the size and shape of the Earth and its gravity field and determining locations and distances, on or just above or below the surface of the Earth. It's all about where things are. In fact, that's often what I would say to people in the past. I'd say geodesy is the science of where things are. I feel kind of bad about that because I came up with that in presentations, and then a few years later, as we started using the science of where, and I said, oh, I should have trademarked it. Oh, well.
The NGS could have been one step ahead of Jack Dangerman. So
it is critical, and it is about the size and shape of the Earth. And sometimes it's the obvious things in life people don't think about is how do we know where things are?
Yes.
Right, on the surface of the Earth, or even Earth's orientation in space and things like that. That's part of what geodesy is about. And you have to have that first before you can do all the other things with mapping.
So you said it's one of the oldest. I guess the one that I think of is Eratosthenes, with the measuring down the well in Egypt. Is it
right?
Is that part of geodesy in the origins, or?
That's the geodesist's favorite story, right? Eratosthenes and figuring out the size of the Earth and getting it pretty darn close to the modern accepted value, which is amazing. And that was, I don't know, a couple of hundred years BC, right? So way back then, he was able to figure out the size and shape of the Earth. And then things had changed since then. But yeah, that was one of the oldest ones.
So I guess the question mine would be is like, okay, I think he was off by 1,000 meters or something. So if he would have been able to calculate the geoid, would he have been closer based on the shade analysis, or?
I don't know. He made some assumptions, right? Assumed a sphere. He assumed the sun's rays are parallel and things like that.
Okay.
I'm going to go in this other direction. Sorry about this, but it depends on the assumptions you make. If Eratosthenes had assumed the Earth was flat, he could have calculated instead the distance to the sun. Now, it would have been wrong, right?
Cool.
So,
that idea.
yeah, I like to throw that one out there because people, assumptions matter. And that's a big thing in science.
Oh, I like that. So how did your educational background, prepare you for this? Is there a geodesist school somewhere in the United States? And, how did you get the training specifically in that area? Because in most GIS programs, we'll do a course on projections and, the fundamentals of map science. But, beyond that, it becomes a surveyor domain in the traditional sense for us. So what is it?
I suppose actually I think it's maybe a little worse than that even. When as your students would find coming out of this program and going out into the world of work, you end up doing things different than you might expect. You think you're going to prepare for a certain career and you go in a different direction. And there was no exception here. I got into geodesy because I got into GPS as part of surveying. And I learned that in the same way most surveyors learn it in half a day in a parking lot from a salesman. And then I knew everything about GPS, right? No, I didn't. I made a lot of mistakes. And then I said I need to learn more. And I did end up looking for a PhD program in geodesy in the US, and there were almost none, right? There were, six in the whole country at the time I was looking. So when you say geodesy, of course, it means different things, but classical geodesy, yes, that's true. Even right now, I don't know. He's trying to call me over here. I don't know how you focus on that because you're so right. There's it seems like there's a whole bunch of programs in geography, for example, but it's just like you said, or my experience has been anyway, that there's very little geodetic content, even very much in any depth about coordinate systems, even though that's a fundamental ingredient to geospatial analysis. There's still not much there. And see if you agree with this. My overall feeling is just because the people running those programs, teaching those programs, also don't have that background. So it's sort of there's a lack of exposure there, and then there's, I think, a discomfort with going too deep into it because it's it's something new even to the instructors. But boy, it's sure coming up a lot nowadays. And it's becoming more important now that. Well, you must see this. GIS is evolving so much. It used to be that GIS was cartoony type maps for things, but now there's people doing super accurate, super precise and accurate work with GIS. And so now you have to get into what all this coordinate system stuff means. How do you make use of those data?
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was thinking of probably in your line of work is where in GIS or an analyst would be fundamental uses of map projections are important to understand, but it's almost more in the survey community and then more specifically your type of work where high precision accuracy or intelligence military as well becomes very important or extremely important. And so they're like, that's why we have Michael around. He'll tell us when we need more accuracy. Do you think that that's kind of true with what geodesists do, is more the precision types of absolute location?
Yeah, I think people make fun of me all the time about the whole accuracy stuff. Like I'm always looking for sub-centimeters. It's not just that. It's even if your data's accuracy is only at several meter level, you still need to know that, right? Because what I see happening, a lot of people take data sets and use them in analyses that they're not appropriate for because, say, the accuracy isn't sufficient for the application. So really knowing that matters. And a big thing in any geospatial system now is dealing with data from different sources. How do you put it together and make sure it lines up correctly? Like in the software that people use, and this is not picking on Esri because I love those guys. I work with them a lot. But you bring in data sets from different sources, a box pops up, right? Everybody's seen this box, coordinate system doesn't line up. What do you want to do? And then you put the button and this list comes down and there's maybe 14 different datum transformations or geographic coordinate system transformations. Which one do you choose? It's not straightforward at all. So that's again at the multi-meter level accuracy, but it's still important to understand.
Let me back up a little just for the tens of viewers out there and ask you, what is the National Geodetic Survey, and then how is it differed from, say, the USGS or other, environmentally related bureaus in the federal government? So what is it that the NGS does for viewers?
Well, that's a really good question to ask, because it's a source of frustration. A lot of people in the geospatial fields don't even know we exist. It's shameful. So we get frustrated when people refer to us as the USGS, for example, right? Because they're a different sort of thing. USGS does mapping, for example. Well, NGS defines the basis for the mapping. So we define what we call the National Spatial Reference System. That's the framework for positioning the United States. Without that, you can't make the maps. And basically, that's the latitude, longitude, and height, scale, orientation, and gravity for the United States. And we define that, and people use that as the basis for making their maps. That's fundamentally what it comes down to. We are the civilian agency responsible for that. Supposedly, every other federal agency, apart from the military, is supposed to use the NSRS that we define. That helps.
Okay. And so what would be some of the current projects that you work on for the NGS, or current projects in the NGS in general? So what are sort of the daily activities and things going on in your life at work?
The really big thing right now, agency-wide, and we're a very small agency, by the way, only a couple hundred people, is this modernizing the National Spatial Reference System. And you probably, I know, have heard about it. I don't know that it's getting all the exposure it needs. Though we did just do a bunch of presentations at that Geodesy conference. What was that, last week? Week before last. So that's getting some exposure in the GIS field. So modernizing NSRS and bringing it, everything we have the systems we have right now are made in the 1980s. Let me put it that way. And a lot has changed since then. And probably the biggest thing is GPS or GNSS and all the other stuff that goes along with that. So we're trying to bring everything up to speed, if you will, for that.
Yeah.
And a big part of the modernizing is recognizing that the Earth is dynamic. Positions change with time. So that's going to be a big component of it. And I know there's probably some discomfort people have with that, but it is reality. So we feel like we have to deal with it and try to make the tools so people can handle it effectively and correctly.
Yeah, so I remember in the 90s and the early 2000s when some of the updates to the NSRS were going on, you'd have news stories like Washington Monument shrinks, or I was in Connecticut, my favorite one, people woke up in this town in Connecticut after generations and found out they were in a different city, because of the property lines moved, and so people were like, oh my gosh, the Earth is moving. We don't know what's going on. So are you going to make people move to different cities with this update too? And I guess we should explain my joke here too, but you know what I mean?
We got to be careful on some of this. It gets people, I don't know, did you see the article that about Four Corners Monument being in the wrong place? That's an example.
Like, did it go to Colorado or something?
Well, it doesn't really matter in a way. So, it's an interesting thing. So the Four Corners Monument, or the people's property lines like you're talking about. Now, Geodesy is not about that. So those are definitionally in the right place. The Four Corners Monument, the reason it seems to be off by, I don't know what it was, a few thousand feet, is because at the time it was established, we used a different meridian for the United States than Greenwich meridian. That's all it is. But it's exactly where it's supposed to be on the ground. Its longitude changed by quite a bit because of that. So there's that aspect of positioning. Remember, we were talking about assumptions before. So part of what makes a position is some of the assumptions that go behind the systems that build it. And even though we might say the latitude and longitude at a point changes, your property corner relative to other property corners around it is unless a surveyor made a mistake, I mean, is in the right place. So that won't change. But the coordinate values themselves can and will change. They do change, if that made sense.
Yeah. No. I mean, I always like say it's the shifting of the grid, not the shifting of the definitions there. And so with the National Spatial Reference System, what are some components of that in the GIS community more broadly? Because it's not, I mean, it's kind of amorphous, but there are some practical things like State Plains Coordinate System and other parts of the CORE system. So what aspects are you been working on with the NSRS?
Well, the big thing for me is updating the State Plain Coordinate System, which you just mentioned. So I think a lot of GIS practitioners use the State Plain Coordinate System. It's predefined, right? You load your software and pick the zone that you're in, and then you use it. And that sort of system is going to continue in the future, but it's going to be different in various ways to what people are used to. Hopefully it's going to be better, right? So we've taken, one thing that's a little different now is we've taken a lot of input from the geospatial community on what they want, what individual states want for State Plain, and that includes Arizona.
Yeah.
And they are going to do things different here.
So what are they doing different? Like, I know that in the past, I was always fascinated, like, is it like Montana and some states that are just like, forget it, we're just going to have one. And then other states do their zones. It seemed to be kind of, some historical precedents in some cases or user preference in others. But now it's I like this sort of community development approach that you're taking, or that NGS is taking.
Yeah, I'm glad we went down that path. It's going to make it more complicated. That was a great observation you just made, though, about Montana, for example. I mean, why does Montana have one zone?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big state, but in State Plain 27, it did have 3 zones, right? So they made a decision to change it to 1 zone later. We're kind of doing both sides now. Arizona, for example, well, every state's going to get a single statewide zone, including Arizona, as one of their layers. And actually, there was a huge interest in that in the GIS community because of statewide applications GIS, having a single geometry for entire state. People love that idea because what happens is a state will just use a UTM zone, even if it doesn't fit right. So that's one side of it. And the other side, the surveyors and engineers, they're worried about the so-called grid versus ground problem, where the distance between a pair of projected coordinates is not actually what you measure on the ground. And so to deal with that, you need to make much smaller zones so that difference can be minimized, and then you can use your map projection directly for engineering projects, for example. And a lot of states are going down that path too, including Arizona. I don't know quite where we are in Arizona because the state's sort of doing their own thing on that, but I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but it looks like maybe 50 zones. That's 50 zones for that multi-zone layer in Arizona. Yeah. In fact, I did design a 4-zone system for Pima County a few years ago, and that I think is going to become part of State Plain 2022. That's my understanding.
Oh, interesting. And I believe, didn't you help? I mean, more jurisdictionally, it made sense to me, but similar to Montana, or being able to have one projection over an entire area, the issue of the Navajo Nation.
Yeah, that one's that's an interesting one too. So how many years ago now, I did design a projected coordinate system for the Navajo Nation. And in case the viewers aren't aware, Navajo Nation is a unique situation. The boundary is in 3 different states. So they're in 5 different state plane zones, 2 different UTM zones. So they have a real problem with having their geospatial data be consistent. And so that was part of the solution. Now for State Plain 2022, they're in a special category. We have something called a special use zones. That's for jurisdictions that are in more than 1 state. And Navajo is a great example of it because it's big. It's the size of West Virginia. And they will have a special use zone in State Plain 2022.
So let's take that example a little bit further. So if you help and I'm assuming you made it as part of being an NGS employee, not just as something.
Well, that was before I worked for NGS, so it was prior to that.
But like does that then, do you work to make that a standard within the NGS, within the National Spatial Reference System to help, you know what I'm saying? Like, how does it become a local projection become part of the standards to be used?
That's a good question, and it's a funky situation right now, but it's real common. So for State Plane 2022, Navajo Nation zone will be part of State Plane. So it'll just be part of the system, so people get it automatically in their software and all that. But a lot of places design coordinate systems that were not part of State Plane, but they were official in the sense that state government agencies or the Navajo Nation accepted them as standards. And then different software vendors would adopt those in their software. And it was standard in the sense that it used the standard map projection algorithms. You just give it the parameters, and it takes latitude and longitude and computes northings and eastings out of it. And you'd see that there's a whole bunch of states that have been part of, say, Esri software for many, many years, even though it's not part of State Plane. Like the Wisconsin has a county coordinate system. It's been in software for decades at this point. And by the way, they will have a system like that in State Plane 2022. So the standards part of it is everybody using a similar algorithm to compute coordinates so we can all get a consistent thing. I don't want to go on too long about that, but there is a standards group. There are standards groups that keep track of that stuff, but it will be easier when things are part of State Plane because it'll be part of the NSRS.
So just to finish the thought on the nation, is there going to be, for Native American GIS, is there going to be a focus on different nations as well too, to create like localized state planes for nations?
It looks like there are. So we have the special use zone is specifically for areas that are more than one state. Most tribal areas, though not, there are others that go outside state boundaries, and most of them are within a state. So for example, I think the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming will be a zone in State Plane, but it'll be entirely within Wyoming. But yes, and I'm seeing more of those for some reservations in Montana too.
And then my second question will be, are you going to be the bane of existence for all GIS people in the next 2 years when they're like, oh my God, I'm Arizona Central 0202. Now Michael Dennis comes along and messes up all my databases and I have to do all my conversions now. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Wow. Yeah. So there's God, this is a big thing, how do you take your data that you already have that might have been really expensive to acquire and manage and migrate it to the modernized National Spatial Reference System? So to answer that part of NGS does have tools for that, and we're going to keep adding on to those tools so people can transform their data. But that's a lazy answer. Yeah, you can click a button and do it, but will it be good enough for your needs? I mean, one thing that's different that we do now and we'll keep doing is we give you uncertainty estimates on how good those transformations are. So you could make an educated decision as to whether it's appropriate, but we will provide tools to do that for absolute sure. That's all part of the package.
What's the benefit then for users to move as the new systems or the State Planes 2022 is adopted nationally? What's the benefits for users to adopt it?
That's always kind of the question with these things. It's a blessing and a curse. We can't make anybody do anything. We're not regulatory. So there's still people mad at us about moving away from NAD 27, right? So not many. They're disappearing. They're dying off. The main advantage of the new system will have other advantages. Like I said, statewide zones obviously have benefit GIS instead of trying to use the central zone for the whole state. And the biggest driver, I think, for the modernized NSRS is making things consistent with GNSS. And dealing with the time part and getting rid of some. There's some quirky things, as users probably don't know about NAD 83, that make it difficult for us to make it compatible with GNSS. So that's part of getting it more accurate and more precise, and things like autonomous vehicles, right? That's the kind of things that we're trying to think about, and how good does stuff have to be to ensure the integrity of those kinds of systems from a geospatial perspective. So yeah, you can keep your stuff in NAD 83, State Plane 83, and some people will, I think, for a long time, people being people. But there will be benefits, and I don't want to go on too long about it, but part of it is data can be expensive. And if people want to make use of freely available data sets prepared by the federal government, say for floodplain mapping or aerial imagery or DEMs, it's all going to be in the modernized NSRS. So if you want to get it and use it in your systems, being consistent with that would help a lot. And one other thing, sorry if I can talk forever about any of this stuff. It's really bad. But some of those states that are designing their own zones for state plane, especially the little low distortion projection ones, they're super excited, actually. So they can't wait to go to the modernized NSRS so they can start using those directly because it's going to help their processes.
So I've seen you a lot in the newspaper articles lately about the standardization of measures associated with state planes. And one of them, which is kind of fun, but also interesting, is, and I guess the way I could ask it is, so what do you have against the U.S. foot? I mean, does this mean that all my shoe sizes are going to change, or the property boundaries are going to move on me again?
Well, yeah.
Especially in the Tucson Daily, you were there holding up a tape measure, and then I hear that tape measure might be going away now too.
I'm going to sell it on eBay after he makes the switch. It'll be an antique, right?
How does that U.S. foot? I guess the first question would be, how does that U.S. foot relate to state planes coordinate system? Like, can you explain, like, a unit of measure to, because we were talking about measuring shape and size of the Earth. So how are you involved? Is the NGS part of weights and measures in the federal government too?
Oh God, these are great questions. And I think this is a topic near and dear to you too, as I understand. So interesting history of NGS, and we used to be called the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. And back in the 1800s, we were part of the Department of the Treasury, right? And Office of Weights and Measures was too. And actually the director, they're called the superintendent back then, was the superintendent of U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey and of the Office of Weights and Measures. And that happened, I'm not sure how that evolved or why, but all of our superintendents back then had those dual roles. And our very first superintendent, one of his big jobs, his name was Ferdinand Hassler, was standardizing weights and measures in the early to mid 1800s. So we've been in that business for a long time historically. Now, in 1901, that changed. That's when we got the Department of Commerce and all that business, and the National Bureau of Standards. So we were part of the history early on, and then it changed. But to answer the other part of your question is, on state plane coordinates, historically they were defined in feet. Right? The very first version of state plane, which was 1920 and done in 1930s, and the version of the U.S. Survey foot back then is what we call the U.S. Survey foot now. Because we defined it that way, once you change the definition of the foot, which I can get into, all those coordinates, because they're such big values, would move by several feet. The coordinate values would change by several feet for a location on the ground, and that could cause problems, which gets into all this thing about how we ended up with these two versions of the foot and all that.
So, well, I'm still stuck on the U.S. Department of Treasury, and knowing me, I'm going to ask the crazier question and say, so I guess, was the NGS around when the International Geodetic Union adopted the meter? Why didn't the United States go along with the Treaty of the Meter?
We did.
But then it wasn't adopted in practice.
Well, gosh, this whole thing's just crazy. So, in 1866, Congress legalized the metric system for commerce. 1866, right? So we were fine with that, and that was all outgrowth of things like the Treaty of the Meter and all that. But it's ironic. We fought this thing called the Revolutionary War to liberate ourselves from Britain, yet we kept using the British system for measurement. So we were using what were called imperial units at the time. People shouldn't use that term anymore, but we were using the British system of measure. But at the same time, this other newfangled thing had come out, the metric system, and they started competing things. And we ended up having a kind of a dual system evolving in the United States because the metric system was come out. It was I hate to use this word, but better, really better defined. More the physical standards used to define were more physically stable. But we had a mess going along. So in the latter part of the 1800s, we had the British standard and we had the metric system, and they were not consistent. And then one of the superintendents of U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, Thomas Mendenhall, gave an order, at least it became an order later on, called the Mendenhall Order. That's when the United States became metric. When we said no more British, no more bronze bar number 11, right? Everything's going to be based on the meter. Everything from that point forward. So at that point, the foot was defined with respect to the meter. And we've been metric ever since, despite what people think.
So you switched from the bronze bar number 11 to the bar in France, in Paris.
Well, no, we had our own 2 copies. And I thought this was kind of clever. You know, for the British Imperial Yard, they had the standard in England, and they made copies of it. We got a couple of copies. One was bronze bar number 11. Well, and it was bronze. When they did the meter bars, they made them out of 90% platinum and 10% iridium, so I'm sure they were expensive. But here's the part I like. They made a whole bunch of them all at once, and they randomized them. There was no single standard, and they shipped 2 of them to us. Now they have the one in Paris, or 2 probably, or whatever, but we have 2 here in the United States, and we still have them. One's meter bar number 20, I think it's number 21 and 27. But we have them in the United States. Of course, they're not used anymore for standards. We do different things, but at the time, they were.
So the dissolution of the U.S. foot is to help improve accuracy or to help normalize agreed upon standards? Like
Probably the latter, I would say. This part, I'm not clear what happened. So I think it's an order, the way I think of a couple different things. Has a funny little history all by itself. By about the time we did the Mendenhall Order, other countries are doing the same thing. They were migrating the metric system and making the metric system the standard against which their units were derived. And it makes more sense to have an exact relationship. So it makes more sense to have an exact, simple relationship between the foot and the meter than one that's based on infinitely repeating decimals, which is what we had with the U.S. survey foot. So actually, I think it started in Britain. They came up with something they ended up calling the industrial inch, and they were using it in industrial applications and things are becoming higher and higher tolerances. So people had to pay more attention to what exact unit they were using. So as part of promoting commerce throughout the world, we created an agreement with the English-speaking countries at that time, which is, United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, etc., to adopt a new standard for the yard or foot or inch. I mean, they're all related. And it's just like today. That's what's so interesting. Nothing changes. In the United States, and the first organization I know of to adopt this international foot or inch or yard, however you want to call it, was the predecessor of the American National Standards Institute. They had a different name. That was in 1933. And things happened slowly. In 1954, NASA, or its predecessor, adopted that. Now, they deal with big distances, right? So all these organizations were adopting the United States. So finally, the National Bureau of Standards in 1959 said, okay, this is enough. The whole United States is going to adopt this new definition of the foot, which is only different by, an eighth of an inch per mile. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny difference. But they adopted for everything in the United States except one thing, which is why we have the problems we have now.
What was that one thing?
That one thing was that damn state plane coordinate system. So remember what I said? So you have a value, let's say it's common to have values in millions of feet in state plane because states are big. So 1 million feet, if there's a 2 part per million difference, that's 2 feet, 2 feet of difference on the ground. So since that system already existed in 1959, and we knew that we were going to update it later, NGS actually went to National Bureau of Standards and asked them to allow us to keep using the old definition of the foot for geodetic surveys, only geodetic surveys, which involve state plane, until we replaced it with a new datum. We knew that was coming, but we just didn't know quite when. And at that time, we named it, that old foot, the U.S. survey foot, to identify that it goes with surveying, even though it meant specifically geodetic surveying and no other application. And it was mandated that it was temporary. And when we redefined the datums, we would switch to the international foot. That was what was supposed to happen. And that happened in 1986. That's when we were supposed to make the change, but we didn't do it.
I guess I'm curious on your view on this, that in talking to other users, sort of the idea that, and you kind of got at it with the reducing the number of measures helps to clean up like multiple users and to have agreed upon systems. Hopefully it dissolves problems. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, me, of course. That like before the meter was adopted in France, there was over 250,000 different units of measures going on. And some people would say that was chaotic, and others would say, no, these were things that were evolved over time through civilization to specify very unique qualities of objects and assets. But they needed to be dissolved to allow for global capital to occur, to have larger agreements to come about. So I guess today, like, what's the difference? Like, why do we want to get rid of some measures? Or I'm sure you're going to have some community members going, no, I'm keeping my US foot, man. Can't take it away from me. Like, how does it help? Is there problems that occur by using multiple measures, within state planes, or,
oh my God,
there are issues that come up for users that?
Yeah, it comes up all the time. That's what's so weird about this whole thing. Now, I don't want to denigrate anyone, but I don't understand the argument behind having two different versions of the foot that are nearly identical. It just creates problems, and that happens all the time. It's happened to me. I mean, heck, I should be in favor of two versions of the foot, because I make money. I made money off of it before I worked for NGS. I made $2,000 in one weekend because of a 3-foot difference at some mine, and it was mainly because of this difference in the foot definition. So it happens over and over again. I've got all sorts of horror stories about it.
Well, give us one horror story. That's what I was trying to think of. Like, give us an example of like where it's important to clean this stuff up, where it's gone wrong.
Oh, well, there's been my own stories. I suppose that one, and because I know it intimately myself. Actually, I paused for a moment because I was thinking about some others, because there's several. But anyway, this one in particular was it was for a mining project, and there were surveyors out there. They're using had been going on for years. And this is what often happens. You get a big project that has a long history. Some group has been working on one time, and then for a reason they don't work on it anymore. Someone else gets it, and you bring in people from different states to work on it. And then mistakes start happening because people use the wrong foot version in their software. And that's what happened here. They were finding these 3-foot discrepancies, and that's just too much for engineering applications, right? You got to have things line up. So in my case, it was, and this is probably usually how it happens. They notice the problem. They're trying to figure out. They don't know what's gone on. And by the time they contact me, they're desperate. So I got contacted like on a Friday. We got this problem. Can you help us? And they needed to have an answer on Monday. Oh, they wanted an answer. I mean, I didn't really know what was going on at the time, but so I was able to figure it out for them and say, this is the problem. And it was balled up. They are using US survey feet for some coordinates, international feet for others, and then having distances in different versions of the foot. It was just and different versions of the project had different units in different places. It was a tangled up mess on that one. And I'm going to add one more thing, which I think is pretty interesting, is I've asked a lot of people for their stories on this because I want to know them, and people are very reluctant to give specifics. They're worried about liability.
Yeah.
That's come up over and over again. They say, well, we had this problem, but we can't really tell you much about it. Like one guy sent me an example from plans that he had. It showed they had coordinates in state plane and US survey feet, but they had plant coordinates for a big facility in international feet. But he had redacted out the state plane coordinates so you couldn't tell where it was in the United States, because he didn't want me to know.
Yeah.
Right? So they say they have the problem, but they don't want to expose, well, maybe the fact that they made a mistake, expose themselves to liability, but that's come up over and over again. So I think it occurs more than people even realize.
I mean, I know a few too, but maybe you could let me know on this one. I had heard that one of the Mars missions had a measurement miscalculation that cost them millions.
That was a metric versus U.S. customary one, is what I understand. But it's a similar thing.
Yeah.
You know what's so, you know, there you got a factor of, you know, 3.28 or whatever difference. So it's pretty big. I'll tell you a little secret. If you want to screw up a survey, say a survey goes out and stakes a bunch of things out, puts a bunch of nails in the ground. They have that pink flagging on there. You don't want to just pull the nail out of the ground and throw it off somewhere. Just move it a little bit. That's the worst thing you could do. That's what makes the foot thing so insidious. That little tiny difference, which could just be a few tenths of a foot in some places or a few feet in others. That's what throws things off, because everything looks okay, but it's not. And it's big enough that you can detect it.
Huh. So I guess, I mean, to try to sum up some of this would be, with your efforts and the NGS's efforts to update the State Plains coordinate system, you're improving the accuracy of the shape and the size of the Earth, or that, and how we understand it with new measures and stuff today. But then it's sort of the legacy of these agreements and measures to help try to make the use of these new tools more accurate and more, I want to say, user-friendly. Does that sound right?
Well, we want to make it so, gosh, we were just having this conversation today. You know, we can't get too proud of all this great, clever stuff we're doing if it's harder to use. Things have to be easier to use so people aren't going to embrace it. So we're real sensitive to that. And just as far as the whole foot thing goes, remember I said we didn't do what we said we would do in 1986. And I think about switching to getting rid of the U.S. survey foot entirely like we were supposed to. And I think the main reason that happened is because we went metric. NGS went metric in 77. So it was not, we didn't have a dog in the fight. The surveyor was all excited about foot versions, but we're totally metric. So State Plain 83 is a metric system, even though Arizona, for example, legislated international feet as the unit they use. The system itself is metric. That's going to be the same as State Plain 2022. It'll be purely metric. But if we provide anything in feet for the modernized NSRS, it will only be the international foot definition, nothing in U.S. survey feet. So we won't do it.
So one more question on measures, and then I'll switch gears. But if the convoluted history of metrics within the U.S., and then I guess, and you said it was adopted, but then it's not like used in practice or daily, you know, there's sort of this mixed up history. I guess the one that I always wonder in Arizona is then, how do we get that metric system down I-19 to Nogales and to Tucson? Like, why there? You know, what happened with that?
Isn't that weird? Well, remember, we're both old enough to remember when we tried to go metric in the late 70s, early 80s, and they started putting up road signs with the kilometers on them, and then they tore them down. I've always assumed that stretch was because of proximity to Mexico. I don't know otherwise why. I thought that was, it's interesting. I would love it if we just went straight metric, even though I think in feet. I still would rather make the change.
So
myself.
It wasn't like an NGS covert
No,
conspiracy
we're not
theory.
We're not. We're not.
To test
We don't
with
have
our
very much
brains,
influence.
just to see if the local Southern Arizona community will adopt the meter, you know, maybe subconsciously, but it didn't work. Okay.
We weren't part of that.
Had to rule out that conspiracy theory. So more generally, how about if people wanted to know more about what the NGS is doing, or this new effort for State Plains coordinate system or the U.S. foot, where would you recommend that they go and look online for more information?
Oh, well, thank goodness for Google. If you type U.S. survey foot into Google, you'll go to National Institute of Standards and Technology webpage. That'll probably be one of the first things that pops up in the search. So that's NIST. That's not NGS. No, we're working with them. That's got a whole bunch of information about the U.S. survey foot, including all a Federal Register notice was just published on October 5th. It's got a citation of that. It's got all this information in there. so the information we have on the NGS website would just point to that one anyway. So that would probably be the best place to go. But again, if you search on US Survey Foot, that one would come up right away. I mean, I could give you the URL, but I'd just be saying it.
Okay. How about the State Plains Coordinate System efforts? Where would we go to look for more information on that?
Well, you go to God, what do we go to the NGS webpage? And I will say that one is geodesy.noaa.gov.
Geodesy.
And then on that page, there's a link over on the side that says State Plane Coordinates. You go in there, and it lands you on a page that talks all about State Plane. And there's even there's preliminary designs for like the Arizona statewide zone and things like that, so people could look at those.
Do they still have your webinar series that's posted?
Yeah, so that's the State Plane pages have all the links to all the webinars on it, and I've given a bunch of them on State Plane now, and a couple on US Survey Foot too. So they're all there, and we have a presentations library with that. We keep all the webinars on our education page.
Yeah, because I've done quite a few of those with you, or when you're the lead on them, and they're fascinating and very informative. So I recommend those.
Excellent, thank you.
And I guess finally, and maybe you can let me know, the NGS used to have a what is Geodesy page, like a history, an educational site as well too. Are you still?
We're supposed to. So if you go, I'm going to just click on it right now. There's not enough of that, in my opinion, on there. So if you go to, again, geodesy.noaa.gov, there's a science and education pull down, and it talks about, and there's about NGS and what NGS does. It seems like it's hard to find some really simple things like what is geodesy. That's even kind of how you started that, and I probably stumbled with that a bit. We recognize that we need more. We have a lot of educational content, but I think sometimes on the very fundamental stuff we sort of miss it a little bit. But one thing I will say is if you go to Science and Education, there's educational videos, and I'm just going to click on that now because there's several, and they're nice and short and really basic on some things about what are datums and even the one on the foot version and things like that. So there's stuff in there. We're trying.
No, it's a good resource, and I've used it a lot too. And it's not always just the geometry or there's down to earth stuff that people can access and understand too.
Yeah, you don't need to have all math help. Geodesy is like I said, a branch of applied mathematics, but you can understand a lot of the concepts without that, and I think they are very useful to geospatial professionals for sure.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Michael, and we look forward to hearing more about your efforts with the National Geodetic Survey, and especially with State Plains Coordinate System and the International Foot.
All right. Thank you, Chris. It was my pleasure.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.